With Legends of Runeterra officially launched and ranked underway, we can finally bring you our first meta report or tier list. Each patch will be bringing you the best of the best that you can play and use to climb the ladder. So all of these decks and guides will be on our website under our tier list, which will be linked down below, so definitely check it out and let us know what you think. Thanks to our deck tracker, we also have access to stats and win rates of the best performing decks, plus our experts' opinions. So we class S tier as the ultimate best, the best of the best decks that you want to be using on the ladder. A tier are going to be our decks that are really good but fall short of S tier, or they are counter decks to S tier decks. Finally, in our B tier we have very solid decks, but they're less played and they might not hold up at the very top end, or we just don't really know enough about them yet. So let's start with our S tier decks, and first up we have our Fearsome Midrange. This is a mid-range deck centered around Elise and Hecarim, using mostly Shadow Isles cards and a pretty even split between followers and spells. It has a surprisingly aggressive early game for a mid-range deck with a lot of fearsome units, but it can also play it slow with plenty of removal, card draw, and a ton of mid-game finishes. This is one of the best meta decks at the moment, partially because it is just so flexible game to game. So early game you can rely on your Elise, Vile Feast, Black Spear, and Mark of the Isles to take care of most aggressive decks and slow it down a little bit. Turn 3 and 4 you can start to play your big threats like Frenzied Skitterer or Wraithcaller, though you can also use these to stall out the game for your Hecarim and your Rasa. Glimpse Beyond is one of your best draws in this deck and one of the really important cards, so if your matchup is particularly slow you can kill off your own board to find your key cards that you need. Deny is also very key to keep board control once you've got it. You'll probably run into this deck a lot too, so Deny can stop your opponents drawing cards and starve them out of cards, so it's really important in your mirror matchups. Our next S tier deck is our Dawn Spiders. This is our sacrifice deck that we predicted would be pretty strong coming into launch, and it has held up over time, playing mostly around your Dawn Speakers. So you sacrifice your units and you slowly buff up your entire board thanks to those Dawn Speakers, +1/+1 to other allies if an ally has died this round. The key is being able to fill your board with low-cost units that you can buff and sacrifice, with very little ways to stop you. Early game you have some removal from cards like Vile Feast, but you also have your challenger units as well, like a Fleet Feather Tracker that will act as removal. Technically, you probably don't have to use your Dawn Speakers to win with this deck. The idea is really taking favorable trades to establish and then keep that board control. Mid-game you should normally have the control, and then you want to press further with a bunch of more late-game cards to finish. So you've got your Hecarim, your Rasa, Thresh, even back-to-back as well will give you enough power to end before they can recover properly. Our last S tier deck is our Elusive Burn deck, which is definitely one of the most popular and frustrating decks to play against on the ladder at the moment. There are tons and tons of elusive decks out there at the moment, but this is one of the best in terms of win rate on the ladder, and it only costs just over 10,000 shards compared to most that are over 25,000. So this deck is all about buffing your elusive units out of removal range and then going to town on your opponent's face. Sounds pretty fun, right? It is the most simple of the S tier decks to play, it's pretty easy to navigate, and there's not much your opponent can do to stop you. Now, as we said, it's pretty simple to play. You buff and you protect your elusive units, and that's the core of the entire deck. The best start you can have will most likely be Inspiring Mentor into a Navori Conspirator, getting a massive 4/3 out on the board and sending the Mentor back to your hand to buff again. This deck can be a little bit hard to recover with if you get behind, so it's extremely important to use your denies well and think a few turns ahead to plan out how you'll find enough damage to finish off your opponent. We're going to move into our A tier decks now, and I think it's about time we looked at a good old Smork deck. The best of these aggressive ones looks to be Spider Aggro for now. You'll throw down a lot of low-cost units, way more than the enemy player can handle or remove, and because we have so many cheap cards, it's extremely easy to use all of your mana each turn on curve. The goal early game doesn't really revolve around specific cards really, it's about flooding the board with units. Since we have so many spiders in this deck as well, Elise isn't going to take very long to level up, but even if you don't draw into her, you can get a huge crowd favorite by having so many allies on the board. You're going to ideally look to do as much damage as possible at the start of the game, which is why we call this a face deck, and then buff your spiders to do some surprise damage and close out the game. The key thing is as long as you can get your Nexus to 10 health, Darius will be leveled up when you draw him, and combined with a buff like Might or Brothers Bond, you can really push through that final damage needed. I did say before that we have a lot of elusive decks. We do have another one here in A tier, but this one is a bit different, pairing it with Freljord instead. The idea is similar, but this is a bit more aggressive, so you're buffing your units that can actually defend or swing in for unblockable damage. This is also the easier of the two elusive decks to play, so it's a pretty good starting point if you want to get into it. Early game is a bit more important with this deck though. You really want to find an Inspiring Mentor and there's something like an Omen Hawk to go with it for a really good start. Unlike the other one, this isn't purely about face damage though. It's supposed to be aggressive obviously, but you can use things to absorb damage more and then recall them back to your hand afterwards to play them again. There are lots of different ways to buff units in this deck specifically, but you can get good value trades without just pushing elusive damage, and that kind of gives it another angle. If you do find things like your Navori Conspirator, Green Glade Duos, or Zed, then you can definitely play way more aggressively and use the elusive to win. Now finally, we do have a Fiora deck, but unlike earlier in beta, we are not pairing her up with Shen into like a barrier Fiora Shen deck. You have two important win conditions in this deck, Fiora and Rivershaper, as you might have guessed by the name Rivershaper Fiora. We think this is one of the harder decks to play since you're countering your opponent just as much as you're actually playing to your own deck strengths, but this is one of the most rewarding when played properly. The obvious win condition is Fiora, right? Killing 4 enemies with her means you just win the game. By now, I'm sure everybody had experienced the Fiora Judgment combination, but if done correctly, this can win you a game in a single turn as she will strike and hopefully kill every battling enemy. Rivershaper is more of like a helping hand. You're drawing the spells that you need to buff and protect Fiora, and we have 24 spells in this deck, so you'll be using them a lot. Without those two, you're going to find things quite difficult, but you do have some elusive units to push for damage, and you have some lifesteal to heal your own Nexus and stall out the game if you can't find your Fiora early enough. So now we're going to move on to our B tier decks, and remember, these are still very good decks. They're still solid. They might have something that lets them down, or we just don't really know exactly how good they are yet. So next up is something pretty different, our first control deck, and featuring none other than Heimerdinger. So as our expert puts this, if you want to make your opponent's life miserable by preventing them from playing the game, then this is the deck for you. I can't really sum it up any better than that. This deck has a whopping 32 spells with only 5 followers, and Capada, I think I'm saying that right, has reached Master Tier with this. We actually have an in-depth guide on his deck from our site, which will be linked down below, so definitely go and check that out, and also check out his other channels, which you'll find there. I think it's pretty clear that Heimerdinger is the most important card in this deck, and you have to play him when you can get maximum value out of it. We're going to get value by playing spells instantly afterwards on the same turn in case he gets removed, so normally Flash of Brilliance to get some elusive boss. Progress Day is our main draw mechanic, and it also gives us our T-Hex as well, which is going to be one of the finishes of the deck. You have spells like Deny, Steel Tempest, and even Will of Ionia that will be used to protect your Heimerdinger, but it's important not to waste them early so you have this combo for later. We do have another control deck next up, and this is what most people consider true control, I think, about stalling the game endlessly with cards like Frostbite. We do have some poison cards in this deck as well, but it's not a Teemo deck. This is actually a face deck, or it eventually plays out as one. So the idea is that you're going to have your Ezreal. You're going to level that Ezreal up after you've targeted enemies 8 times, which is not too difficult considering the deck and the amount of spells you have. A lot of these spells as well are burst speed, so there is no chance for the enemy to deny or stop them. You play and it instantly casts. You don't have a lot of direct damage on those burst spells, but with Ezreal leveled up, you do 2 damage to the enemy Nexus per spell you play. The idea is that you play a bit defensively, you play cards like Clump of Wumps or Chump Wump to get your Mushroom Clouds, and then you wait until Ezreal is leveled. You're actually not using those Mushroom Clouds to put mushrooms into the enemy deck. You're keeping them because they only cost 1 mana, so you're going to have 3 or 4 of them, and then when you play your Ezreal, you play these instantly afterwards for like 8 damage to the face. Because Ezreal is leveled and because they're burst, they instantly play out, and it's 2 damage to the enemy Nexus per one you play. There's basically no counterplay if you set this up properly. Next up, we have one of our most aggressive decks you'll find played, which is Discard Aggro. It's basically a burn deck. You'll use Jinx and Draven to fuel your hand to draw a lot more after having a strong start and dumping all of your cards. This is where the burn part comes in as you finish with damage to the face, but that's also the skill part of the deck, knowing when you have to use it for removal instead and which cards you can and can't discard. Even though it is a very aggressive deck, it's actually not required to play completely full-on balls to the wall. If you get a Boom Crew early, then you can have some good early Nexus damage and have pretty good board state, so you can play really aggressive. Otherwise, you're ideally finding a Draven's biggest fan on turn 1 or 2, and then putting Draven out on 3 to get some really quick attacks off. Jinx is more of a mid-game finisher with Augmented Experimenter. They're going to be the ways that you can refill your hand after you've dumped them early. Jinx especially will draw 1 each turn, and when you empty your hand, will summon a Super Mega Death Rocket that only costs 2 and deals 4 damage to enemy Nexus, also dealing 1 damage to all other enemies. Also, since Augmented Experimenter is so important to this deck to draw into your cards that you actually need, you want to keep in mind that the effect is actually a spell and it can be denied, so try and play around it as much as possible. Next up, we have a pretty good starter deck. So Zed Elise is probably one of the best budget decks that you can play that is still very competitive at the moment. It's very easy to pilot, it's very easy to build. You rely on Demacian elite cards and simply just outvaluing the opponent's deck with really good trades and buffs. The deck can seem extremely oppressive with a good start, since every turn you should have another unit or 2 to play out on curve. There are no tricky win conditions here either. You'll be playing for your board, like trading off where you can and just being very difficult to remove. One of the things that is really important here is keeping your Battlesmiths alive. Well, well, and finding them I guess is why in the first place. When you summon an elite with the Battlesmith out, you give it +1/+1, but these elites already have very good stats, and this just makes them even stronger. The spell back-to-back can also give 2 allies +3/+3 and burst through to close out the game or get complete dominance on board. We're only really going into Ionia for the deny here, honestly, but that means that you can also take Zed in this deck for some early game damage, but you can easily swap that out for a Garen or pretty much anything else really. So last up, who doesn't like a good old Chariot, and especially when it's very sneaky? This is one of the only decks using ephemeral cards, even though it's probably one of the coolest mechanics we have in the game. You'll be using those and elusive units to push damage, and use cards like Zed Chariot to generate free attackers. Zed is really your early game, Hecarim is your mid game, and neither require much setup, so they can be played even without being leveled up or much before it. Even though we only have a few Shadow Isle cards in this deck, we have a ton of synergy from the Ionian side of the deck with it. When we have cards like Greenglade Duo or Sparring Student, your board can quickly get out of control with summons from Zed and Zed Chariot together. There is a ton of burst damage in this deck, even when it looks like you don't really have much threat out there because you can buff up units so well. You can also use cards like Hecarim and Wayfinder to summon even more units, giving you huge swing turns and buffing them up even more. That's really the deck in a nutshell. So in future episodes, we're going to have more of an introduction to any changes that we have in the meta and also more about how to counter meta decks. But for now, this should be a really good summary of the meta that we have. Thank you for watching, and remember to check out our deck tracker and tier list site linked down below, and we'll catch you in our next meta report.